All right, our first speaker today, I had never had a chance to meet him before, so it's my first opportunity. Great guy from Northern California, actually born in Orange County, moved up to Northern California, so this is a guy that you can hit with all your questions about, especially the Northern California lakes. Clear Lake, Oroville, Shasta, all those places. How many of you guys fish some of the Northern California lakes? Most of you, okay, good deal. If you've heard of Clear Lake, he's supposed to be an expert there, so you can pick his brain there. Started off fishing as a kid pretty much his whole life. Said he actually started with some saltwater and then went into the bass thing, joined a bass club, so came up through the ranks like most bass fishermen. Difference is that at 16 started fishing the BFLs, and at 17, the youngest ever qualifier for the All-American, at 17 years old. That's quite an accomplishment. That is a tough event to make. Started fishing the Everstarts at 18 because he qualified through the BFL. At 20, was already fishing out on the FLW Tour. That's the big boys right there. First year had a second place, so at 20 years old already had a second place under his belt. This year he had 2 wins, of course one of them was everybody knows about. Had 2 wins, 4 top 10s. He is ranked number 10 in the world already at age 24 and has already won about $1.5 million in tournament winnings. Youngest ever FLW champion. How about a big hand, Michael Bennett?
Thank you very much. Well, first off, it's an honor to be here. It's my first time being at Bass-a-thon. Awesome experience so far, hands down. Today, I was kind of struggling on what I wanted to talk about most. So I decided I'm going to talk about kind of everything I did this year and how the key baits for me, the ways I fish, things that are going to work West Coast for you. But I took to the East Coast because I'm a West Coast fisherman and, applied it, and it worked out tremendous for me this year. So pretty much I'm going to kind of take you tournament per tournament that I went to, how I dissected the lakes, the baits I used, and how you can apply them to the West Coast. So the first tournament of the year was Lake Toho for me. And it was kind of a post-spawn, mostly bite. There's a few fish that haven't spawned yet. But Lake Toho is a grass lake. I mean, there's hydrilla, there's pencil reeds, there's, it looks kind of like a swamp almost. I mean, it's real shallow all the way throughout. But to me, it relates a lot to the California Delta, a little bit to the north end of Clear Lake. That tournament, I really approached it as keep an open mind. The fishing wasn't extremely good, but I went out there and I found a few different types of ways to catch fish, but my predominant bait or choice was a chatterbait. It's just a bait. It's kind of like a jig that has a blade on the front of it. It has a crazy vibration in the water. And this bait is very, very versatile. I mean, you can fish it for spotted bass in clear water. You can fish it for big largemouth and a little bit stained water. But for that tournament, I was throwing like a green pumpkin colored one, 3/8 ounce with just a twin tail grub on the back. And the keys to fishing this bait, though, are you need to either throw it on fluorocarbon line or braided line. And what that does is it eliminates the stretch on the line. And that enables the bait to have a way better wider action to it. So that's probably the #1 key I recommend anyone who throws this bait is to throw it on fluorocarbon. And I like throwing fluorocarbon in clear water, and I like throwing braided line and a little bit more stained to muddy water. And the biggest key is it's very similar to a spinnerbait. Spinnerbait or a rattle trap. I mean, pretty much it's real basic to throw. All you're going to do is cast it out. You're going to slowly reel it in. You're going to feel your vibrations. As you start to bring it in, if you start to slow it down, you're going to notice your line starts kicking, a foot to the side each direction. And that's because the wobble is incredible on this bait. I mean, it's way better than you can get from a crankbait, way better than you can get from a rattle trap. And it's, very, very versatile bait again. But the big key is, as you're reeling it, you're going to notice your wobble starts to get wider. And then there will be a point where you either say, okay, I'm getting my bites when it's really wide or when it's a little bit tighter together. And that's just dictating on how fast you're reeling the bait. So my biggest key is I throw it out there and I'll make, 10 casts with, a real wide wobble, I'll make 10 casts with a little bit quicker wobble, and soon you're going to start realizing, hey, I'm getting, a few more bites on the wider wobble or a few more bites on the little bit tighter wobble. And also another big key is always keep your rod tip a little bit higher as you're reeling it. It allows the line to kind of stay above the water a little bit more. It's going to cut through grass better. It's going to keep you out of more structure, and allows the bait to have a little more freedom as it's working through. Anytime you get grass caught up on it, you're going to have to kind of jerk it like a rattle trap you would to get it out of the grass. It's actually a pretty weedless bait, so it comes off pretty easy. I like to throw it on probably about a 6.5 to 7 foot rod, medium heavy action, something you'd throw spinnerbait on. You could do, a half fiberglass, half composite rod if you want. That's a great rod for it, or you could just do a complete graphite rod. It's totally up to you, but you need something with a backbone. I mean, this hook in it's a pretty good size hook. You don't need to have, you can get away with manhandling the fish a little bit. So a little bit stiffer rod, for sure. And it's something you definitely want to throw on a bait casting reel. You want to have, throwing 17 to 25 pound fluorocarbon, or, you can get away with 50-pound braided line. I mean, you catch the fish, you can horse them, get them to the boat pretty easy. With this, it's unlike a spinnerbait. I don't typically ever throw a trailer hook with it. For whatever reason, you get bit, these fish eat it. A lot of times when you're throwing spinnerbait, you'll start getting short strikes, you'll start missing fish, things along those lines. For whatever reason, anytime, unless I'm in super clear water, I get bit, the fish is eating the bait. I mean, they engulf it. It's, pretty much a done deal. Sometimes you're throwing real clear water for spotted bass. It's a good idea to throw a trailer hook. Spotted bass, they come up the last second, they might say, hey, that doesn't look exactly right, and they're going to slap at it a little bit more, and you'll miss a few. But for the most part, anytime you're throwing this bait in fairly stained to dirty water, you don't need to throw a trailer hook with it. Colors-wise, I always recommend throwing, try to match the hatch. If you're on a clear lake, that stuff, more shad pattern, it's going to look more natural. If you're fishing, a little bit dirtier water, I like throwing a green pumpkin, something with a little bit red or black color to it. It works great at the California Delta. Brett Height ended up winning 2 events on it this year. One at Toho, the one I ended up fishing, and one at the California Delta in March. And he caught, he almost averaged 5-pound average at both places. He was catching monster fish, and this was his bait of choice. And I ended up throwing a tow. I finished 22nd place. First day, I had a real rough day. I think I had 2 fish for 3 pounds. I was in 125th place, somewhere around there. I was really struggling. Second day, the wind had just changed directions. My water kind of cleared up a little bit, and I'm catching about 17 pounds and jumped up from like 130th to 22nd place with it. It's a phenomenal bait. It's something I'd definitely always kind of keep on the deck. It's very versatile again. You can fish it about anywhere. The next bait I'm going to talk about is a wacky rig Senko. Now this I was very fortunate and won Smith Lake this year with it. And it was probably, I probably caught 80% of the fish I weighed on it all week. I caught a few fish throwing a drop shot and throwing a shaky head to bedding fish. But 80% of the fish I caught was on a wacky rig Senko. Now this bait, any Senko is a phenomenal product. It catches more big fish probably for me than any bait out on the market. And it's very versatile. You can throw it all year long. You can throw it, when the water's 50 degrees. You can throw it when it's, 80. It doesn't matter. So for me, what I like to do is throw it on a real limber rod, because I like to throw it wacky style with a smaller hook. For me, it gets the best action. It's going to have a lot more, wobble to it as it falls. You can throw it like a Texas rig with like a 2 to 3/0 hook, which is great, but the action's not quite as good as it is if you rig it wacky style. One little trick I'd love to do is I'd put what's called an O-ring on it. I slide it up the tail, up the bait to kind of right in the middle of it almost, and then I rig my hook. The particular hook I throw, I'm not endorsed by them or anything, but is an odor mosquito hook. For me, it's the best hook-up to land ratio hook on the market for this type of fishing. There's Gamakatsu, there's a lot of products out there, other hook companies that make great hooks, but for me, this is what I use. It's a little bit heavier wire hook. It's not going to bend when you hook a big fish. It's really, really, for me, the best hook I have found for this particular. I like to throw a size 1 or up to a 1/0 depending on, how big a fish I'm catching. Size 1 will be anything, most lakes I'm catching up to 4-pounders. If you go to Clear Lake or the Delta, I've caught a lot of fish there. I'll throw typically a 1/0 because you never know when you're going to catch an 8 to 10-pound fish. I like to throw it, this particular style, anywhere from 6-pound line to 10-pound line. Always throw it on a spinning rod. Some guys will throw, at the Delta or Clear Lake, they'll throw it on a bait casting rod at a 15-pound line. They'll throw a lot bigger hook. But I don't know, I think you're going to get a little bit more bites if you throw lighter line, something that's going to make it fall a lot more natural. Again, I'd love to throw it on fluorocarbon. Fluorocarbon is, invisible in the water, no stretch. So when you hook a fish, you're going to get great hook penetration, and they're not going to, pretty much know that there's even fishing line on the bait. This particular rod has a lot of bend to it. The main reason for this is we're throwing such a small hook. Now, if you're throwing, a bigger hook or whatnot, you can get away with a lot stiffer rod. But because this hook is smaller, I like to throw something that's got a very soft tip, but it's still got a little bit of a backbone. So when you do hook the fish, you're penetrating all the way past the bar. A lot of rods are going to have, no backbone whatsoever, and what happens is you'll stick the fish, but it doesn't penetrate all the way through. So halfway back to the boat, it might come off, or it's too stiff and it pulls out of the fish's mouth way too easy. So, the fish goes on a hard run, it's just going to pop out. So if you start losing fish, it's either because your rod's too stiff or it's because it's too light. There should be a happy medium where you have, a real soft tip and the backbone still goes up to, pretty high. Again, I throw it on a spinning reel. This particular one's a Bougar Sierra. It doesn't really matter which brand you throw, but fluorocarbon line's a big, big factor. As I'm fishing this bait, though, for me, I threw this at Smith Lake. I was fishing suspended fish. So there's a lot of docks in Smith Lake that'll be over 80 feet of water. And a lot of people go, 80 feet of water, way too deep, I'm not even going to fish there. But the fish were suspended underneath the docks. And I would pretty much skip this bait into tight places, underneath the docks, to the edge of the docks, around cables, things along those lines. And it was a waiting game. And I would just let it free fall on, open the bail, let it free fall, slack line, and it would fall for probably, anywhere from 10 to 25 seconds. It was painfully agonizing to do that. I mean, you just sit there and you have to wait and wait and wait. And eventually your line's either going to kind of start sinking a little bit faster, and you're like, okay, that could be a bite. Sometimes it jumps, sometimes it does nothing. And you pick it up and you're like, okay, my line's starting to swim out. I mean, sometimes you can easily detect the bite when it jumps. Sometimes it, shoots off a little bit quicker. But that particular tournament, we had a little bit colder water conditions, and we had a little cold front come in. Most of them were just a pressure bite. You'd pick it up and you're like, there's a little bit of pressure there, but you're over 80 feet of water. I mean, it's got to be a fish for the most part. So it was a great technique. I caught a lot of big spotted bass on it. That particular tournament, I weighed spotted bass 4 days in a row. I never weighed a largemouth. The lake had several largemouth in it, but the spotted bass were suspended. Largemouth were more on the bank spawning and doing other things. But this phenomenal technique for Oroville, Shasta, Clear Lake, Delta, any of those lakes down here in Southern California, I guarantee it would work great. Again, works year-round. Probably the best time of year will be a pre-spawn bite, probably a couple weeks before the fish start going onto the beds, and a post-spawn bite after they've spawned. Once they kind of start roaming, they're looking to eat. Water temperatures got a little bit warmer. It's a great slow presentation to entice a big female to eat after she's came off the bed. Again, works in the fall, all year long. Big thing with it, though, is the waiting game of letting it sink. Down in Southern California, I know the waters are real clear. The fish tend sometimes to be a little bit deeper. I've caught fish down to 50, 60 feet of water with this. But again, I typically like to make a long cast. And, you're just going to kind of leave the bail open, wait, up to a minute and a half. But the nice thing is, because it falls so slow in the water, your strike range is a lot bigger. Those fish, especially in clear water, can come from 10, 20, 30 feet away. They're going to see this thing slowly falling. They're going to slowly work their way towards it. And then the bait's still slowly falling, so it doesn't ever get out of their view, where they're going to keep following it and end up eating the bait more times than not. Color-wise, you can fish any color with a Senko. It's unbelievably productive bait. For me, I like to throw real natural colors. If I'm fishing clear water, I'll throw a shad-based color, something kind of with smoke color, green pumpkins, watermelon, watermelon red. This particular one's a cinnamon with black and purple flake. Every one of them's a great color that I've seen. I haven't really noticed anything along those lines of an unproductive color with this thing. But for me, I caught a ton of fish on it back east this year. I caught them at Lake Norman, Smith Lake, the one I won. Just phenomenal, phenomenal bait. This kind of rig, I like to typically throw the 5-inch. I've never been a big fan of throwing a 4-inch bait. It just doesn't have, you know, the wiggle a 5-inch produces. I will throw a 6-inch. Typically, the 6-inch is a bulkier bait. If you're going to throw that, you can throw a little bit bigger hook, you know, a 2-aught potentially, something like this style, or just a bigger straight shanked, you know, worm hook that's going to be 2 or 3-aught size. I like to throw those a lot of times more Texas rig. Typically, when I throw a 6-inch Senko, it's in a little bit dirtier water. I'll rig it with an offset hook, throw it weightless, let it fall in a little bit dirtier water. This is probably more predominant when you have 2 to 12-foot visibility, something a little bit clearer. Sorry, go ahead. Yes, absolutely. Anytime I'm throwing a wacky style bait, I use O-rings. What the O-ring does, it saves you a lot of Senkos. Typically, I'll still skin hook the bait. You put the O-ring on, and you still skin hook it going in about a 1/4 inch. And as you catch fish, more times than not, you're not going to lose your Senko. It's going to stay on the O-ring. So I just start to work my way around the bait. I'll just rotate it, go in a circle. It doesn't, to me, it doesn't matter if the, you know, which direction the Senko is, if it's on its side, if it's flat, it doesn't matter. So I just work my way until it pretty much is going to fall off on its own. Which rod? This is a Fenwick. It's a 7-foot MM Techna AV is the rod. I use everything from Berkeley to normal Senkos, Yamamoto. I mean, it's more the horizontal fall. I don't think it's the bait as much. Personally, I grew up fishing the Yamamoto bait more, but Berkeley makes a great sinking minnow. The only deal with that is it's a little bit messy because it comes in the Gulf product. If you don't mind the stink on your fingers and that stuff, it's a great product too. It all depends on the docks. The ones I was fishing Smith Lake, they were 80 feet deep. 80. But the fish were suspended and they'd be anywhere from 5 to 30 feet below the dock. So I would count to typically 30. You know, this bait falls probably close to a foot a second, maybe not quite that much. So I would count, 30 to 45 seconds, depending. And a lot of times you'll start getting signs like, hey, it fell 5 feet, that's when I got a bite. Those fish are probably more in that 5-foot range underneath the dock. So if you're fishing real deep docks, just wait and you'll start being like, hey, I'm getting bit between 10 and 15 seconds. So once it gets to 20, I may as well reel in, make another cast. But Clear Lake, Delta, that stuff, it's shallow. I mean, you're fishing docks that, are no more than 15, 20 feet deep typically. And I mean, this thing works great. I've caught fish in 6 inches of water on it. It just depends on where the fish are at. That's the biggest thing. Very much suspended. At Shasta and Orville, a lot of times you'll find a great point. There's a rock pile, a high spot, something along those lines. I throw this bait over 30 feet of water, and I'm going to count it down. Spotted bass have a great tendency to suspend. They chase bait over 100 feet of water a lot of time of the year. So just look for an ambush point, like a high spot that they could push bait up, a good rocky point that the fish could be, off 40, 50 feet of water, but they come up to 15 to 20 feet throughout the day and feed. And you can cast in that, 30-foot range, let it slow fall, and it's going to entice them from a further distance away to come up and eat it because of how slow it's falling. It looks like an easy prey. Yes? Scent, I'm not a huge scent person. I don't feel it's a necessity. I think there is times where it can help, but typically I don't throw it. I think if you're starting to get a lot of short strikes or a lot of fish that are just barely grabbing a bait, scent is going to improve, them to eat the bait all the way. But more times than not, bass, they're pretty curious. They're typically eat the bait, it's gone. I mean, sometimes scents allow them to hang on to it longer, but more times than not, if a big fish eats the bait, it's on his way. He's going to try to swallow it typically before, you know, I mean, he might swim around for 10 seconds and then spit it, but by then, hopefully you detected the strike and can set the hook. Other than that, I really don't throw scent much. I mean, there's a few times where it's like, okay, I keep getting bit. It feels like it's just picking up half the bait and spitting it. You know, you'll get that several times. It doesn't seem to matter. The only species of bass I have found that scent makes a huge difference for is smallmouth. Not sure exactly the reasons, but smallmouth, they tend to typically be more scent oriented. A lot of times you'll get short strikes, and in real clear water you can see a 4-pounder swim up and he like just grab the tail and spit it, you know, and things like that. But if it's got the right scent on it or a good smell, more times than not they'll actually taste it and eat it more. But for spotted bass and largemouths, I haven't really found scent being a huge factor. Any other questions about this bait? Yes? The only time I tend to dead stick it is going to be when an actual spawn is going on. Like if you know there's bedding fish taking place, the water might be a little dirty where you can't see them, or you actually see a bedding fish, typically I'll dead stick it longer. If you go to Clear Lake or the Delta, a lot of times there'll be big holes in tules where you're like, okay, there could be a bedding fish there. I'll cast this bait into there, let it sit on the bottom. I typically have a hard time just letting it sit there and not do anything, so I'll lightly shake the line to give it a little bit of vibration on the bottom. I think for me, you know, you hear of dead sticking as a technique, and you know, people think that it's just sitting on the bottom, but I think more times than not when people refer to dead sticking, it's casting, not doing anything, just letting the bait sink at its natural weight, and just be real, like taking your time and not, you know, reeling in, making a lot of casts. But sometimes I've seen it where you let it go all the way to the bottom and lightly shake it, give it a little bit of vibration, and you'll get more bites that way. Yes? This is Berkeley 100% fluorocarbon. I've thrown several brands, but this to me is very, very abrasion resistant, very, very strong. I've caught a lot of big fish on it. I mean, fluorocarbon for me is a very, very, it's really helped my fishing. I probably started throwing it 2 to 3 years ago. It's made a world of difference. I mean, you have way better hook sets, you have way, way more sensitivity, and the line sinks, but that's, you know, sometimes you rather have a floating line that you can see what's going on with, but for the most part, fluorocarbon is what I fish with unless I'm throwing top water. Yes, ma'am? It depends on the situation. For me, tournament situation, I'll change it every day of the tournament. If it's a rod, you know, I threw a fair amount of the day with, I typically switch line every day. If it's just, you know, I'm going out practicing or recreational fishing, I typically don't need to switch the line until it gets, you know, on a spinning rod, you'll switch it more because it gets so spun up. Occasionally you'll need to switch it, you know, every 2-3 times out because, you know, line just starts shooting off the reel or it gets in a big rat's nest. Something along those lines because of how the way it spins on the reel, it gets so spun up. I mean, you control it behind the back of the boat and get the spins out and stuff, but line's typically good for a couple weeks to, you know, a couple months, depending on if you keep it out of the sun and if it's not like being kind of abused by the UV rays. This is particularly, I believe it's 6 pound. I love to throw this. The lightest pound test I typically throw 6 pound test. I mean, there's a lot of guys who are like, oh, I throw 4 or 3 or crazy 5, you know, that stuff. For me, 6 pounds the lightest I go, and the only reason I'll occasionally do that is just for more of a natural fall to the bait. I personally don't think bass are too line sensitive between like 6 and 8, but sometimes the bait falls a little bit freer. It's going to fall a little more natural with 6 versus, same thing with the drop shot, versus 8 pound. But those two, it's real close, like 2 pound test difference, it's not going to make a huge factor. And the actual 8 versus 6, you'll get a lot more strength in the 8. If you go down to 4, I just think, I personally don't, but that's just my personal view. Yes? It's on tour. It's actually becoming a lot more popular where guys are throwing braid with a fluorocarbon leader. Personally, I've experimented with a little bit. It does have a few pluses, but again, you can cast a little bit further with having braid as backing almost, and having, you know, a 5 to 10 foot leader of fluorocarbon. I haven't done it a ton. It's something I'm starting to experiment with. It's something that I look at it like, okay, you have another knot in the line, and fluorocarbon is very, I mean, it has no stretch in it, so it's similar to braid. The only benefit is with the braided line is you can cast further, and it's a little more sensitive. So I haven't quite weighed out all options. It's something I'm starting to experiment with. Yes. The braided with the backing and fluorocarbon. Is that what you're referring to?
Using braid on your tank earlier.
I typically will throw. I don't typically throw. Sorry. On the chatterbait, I was throwing the braid. On the Senko, I typically always throw fluorocarbon. If I was to ever throw braid, it's because I'm like throwing the Senko into, a very hard to get out spot, middle of a tree, into thick grass, something along those lines. I can see throwing braid where it rips out of the grass and trees a little bit easier and it'll get the fish out easier. But for me personally, I'll just throw the fluorocarbon 99% of the time. Okay, any other questions about this technique? Okay, for me, the next bait I'm going to talk about is a swim bait. This particular one's a smaller 4-inch Berkeley hollow belly swim bait. This year I was fishing Lake Norman. I caught several fish on that Senko technique skipping around docks, but the swim bait was also a big key for me. And Bass Tricks obviously came out a couple of years ago. The hollow bellies came out since then, and several other brands that are a little bit wider action wobble swim baits. They're hollow belly, obviously. They're very effective. This year they came out with a 4-inch model, and I think the 5-inch model is starting to get overfished. Still catches fish, but this year at Norman, the water was super clear. We're not catching giant bass. We're catching 3-pounders, a big one. For me, the 4-inch model ended up having a few more fish commit to it. When I was throwing the 5-inch model, I'd have several fish that would chase the bait, but they wouldn't eat it. So with the 4-inch model, it's a little bit smaller profile. I think the fish decided, hey, I haven't seen this as much. Also, the bait wasn't that big. So they would chase it a little bit, and I could actually stop the bait, and they'd come up and eat it more. These hollow belly swim baits are amazing baits. They've really kicked off the swim bait bite the last couple years and got it a lot further than it's been. Because you can catch 2 to 4 pound fish on it. Throwing a 6 to 12-inch swim bait, you're more likely fishing for a 5 to 10 pound bite. Not always, but that's more the case. But these are stuff that have became very popular back east. Because back east, there's very few places that have trout in them. The forage is more shad based, so your bait size is not as big. But the hollow belly has a great action. The bait pretty much wobbles back and forth, the tail kicks. It's a great way to catch fish. This particular 4-inch model, the way I was catching a lot of fish were schooling fish that would be coming up chasing bait on the surface. And I was making a really long cast with 6-pound test line, and I'd reel it through there and the fish would come up and eat it. For me, when I'm throwing a swim bait, the only time I'm throwing it on a spinning rod is if I'm throwing the small 4-inch version. I'll throw it on 6 or 8 pound test just for casting distance. But other than that, I'd love to throw swim baits. It's probably one of my favorite things to do when they're biting it. They can be very frustrating because a lot of times the fish will just follow it, smack at it, chase it, things along those lines. But swim baits are very temperamental. The weather can change, little things in the pressure, things that you don't even know are happening. It's like one day you can go out there and have 30 pounds, the next day you go out there and not even catch a fish. You'll have big ones chase it or big ones smack at it, things along those lines, but they won't eat it. So on tour, it's a very hard bait to win with because conditions have to be absolutely perfect for it to happen. There's several times you can catch 1 or 2 key fish throughout the day on it, but day to day, to throw it all day long and get 5 bites consistently each day, it's very hard to do because little things in the weather and changes of pressure, cloud cover, sun, water temperature, any of those things can really affect how much the fish eat the bait versus smack at it or just follow it. For me, this particular year, I was throwing the 4-inch version, and it worked a little bit better because the fish, I don't think had seen it as much. And it was a little bit more of a finesse technique, and I think the fish really kind of keyed on that a little bit more, and I caught a few more fish on it than I had been with the 5-inch. It's a great bait. I would recommend anyone who's interested in getting into swim baits, this is a great way to start besides going giant with the bigger stuff, which works great, but you'll catch a lot more fish on a 4 to 6 inch swim bait versus a 9 to 12 inch swim bait. Yes? This particular rod is a little bit stiffer. The hook's a little bit bigger. I'm throwing an offset. It's got a weight on it to get the bait a little bit down there. This particular rod's got a lot more backbone to it. It's got a little bit of a soft tip for enables you to throw the lighter bait. You can cast a lot further with a little bit softer tip. It lets it whip out there a little bit further. But the rod itself, it's a Fenwick 6.9. I believe this is the jig worm rod. And it's a very, very good rod. Yes? This particular hook is an offset EWG. It's probably got about an 1/8 ounce worth of weight on it. Yeah, it's probably about 3/0 hook. It's actually the hook that comes with the bait in the package. A lot of people are like, hey, I want one size bigger, one size bigger. A lot of people throw like the 6 inch instead of a 5/0 hook, or the 6/0 versus the 5/0 hook that comes with the bait. But personally, I have not had one problem with throwing a 5/0 hook in the hollow belly swim bait or this 3/0 in the 4-inch hollow belly. This is the Berkeley hollow belly swim bait. They pretty much very, very similar to your Bass Tricks. There's really not a whole lot of difference. They came out with a few different colors. Very, very versatile bait. When you're fishing this bait, though, it works great for spotted bass, smallmouth, largemouth. It's an all-around species bait. I'd love to throw swim baits in lakes that the water is a little bit clear. If you got more than 2.5, 3 foot visibility, the fish can find the bait enough and you can catch them in that kind of clarity of water. If it's real dirty, the fish typically, are eating more off vibration, things like that. It doesn't put enough off where the fish are going to be able to hone in on it on time to eat it more times than not. So if you've got clarity, water clarity, great way to fish it. Also, a lot of times I've noticed you'll have a day where fish follow the bait more than anything. They'll come up, they'll chase the bait, they'll occasionally bump at it, but they typically don't eat it. In those days, the biggest key I found is your ambush or your casting range. You need to set up a very, very good ambush point. So if you see a dock, instead of casting straight to the dock, I typically like to get next to the dock and cast past the dock and reel it past it, because the fish, if you cast straight to the dock, typically as you're reeling out, the fish will attract out from the dock and they'll start to follow the bait. But if you cast parallel to the dock and get it where you're actually burning it in front of the dock or straight along the side of the dock, the fish only has to come out 6 to 8 inches to eat the bait, and they don't really look at it as much. So they'll actually eat it more times than not. And also, sometimes when they're not eating it very good, I like to actually speed up the speed of the bait and reel it a little bit quicker so they don't get a look at it as long. They have to either say, I'm going to eat it right away, or I'm going to not even chase the bait. And a lot of times you'll get more fish to commit to it that way. Favorite colors, I like gizzard shad, threadfin shad. It's called, the colors hollow belly makes, but more natural colors. They make a trout pattern that's pretty good. Out here, anything that's more natural looking, they make a trout. A blueback herring looks very good. If you go to Clear Lake, they make a hitch color that has a little bit of gold to it, but that is more if the water's a little bit stained. I'll throw the stuff with a little more flash to it. If the water is a little bit clear, I like to have more of a transparent bait that doesn't attract as much attention. Yes?
6 inch on the same setup?
If I throw the 5 or the 6 inch, I throw it on a bait casting rod. I'll throw it with anywhere from 15 to 20 pound fluorocarbon. And then they make the weighted EWG hooks. A lot of companies have came out with them now. They make them in different weights. You can get them in as light as 3/16 or 1/8 ounce to up to like 1/2 ounce. And one thing I've learned is if the fish aren't committing much to the bait, throw the little bit heavier, the 1/2 ounce weight, and you can reel it a little bit quicker. That helps a lot of times. For spotted bass, I like to throw a little bit heavier of a weighted hook just to get the bait down deeper. If you're fishing clearer bodies of water where the fish are a little bit deeper, you'll need the heavier weight, obviously. But around Clear Lake, the Delta, typically quarter ounce is probably the number 1 bait I would throw. Yes?
Do you count it down to see where it comes?
Typically I don't. I really don't. For me, a lot of times, as soon as the bait hits the water, if you're fishing probably under, I'd say, 10 feet of water, just the splash alone, a lot of times the fish will kind of peek up. And I like to just start reeling it then. More bites you'll probably get within the first 5 or 6 feet you reel the bait than anything. And a lot of times an aggressive fish will be down there, and as soon as he sees that bait moving, he's going to start coming at it as quick as he can. Sometimes you'll get bites 3 feet from the boat, but more times than not, I mean, it's in that first 5 or 6 foot section that you start reeling. Yes?
How do you work it? Do you slow crank it? Do you change the tree?
For me, it's depending. If there's a piece of structure I'm actually fishing along instead of just going down some random bank, I like to throw it past the piece of structure a good 5 or 6 feet. And as I reel right up to the structure, if you can get it where the bait actually almost hits the structure and bounces off or deflects a little bit, a lot of times it'll create more of a reaction strike. But other than that, I typically like to reel at a consistent speed. I don't change it a whole lot. I'll be reeling, it's kind of like fishing anything else, spinnerbait, any type of reaction bait where you reel it at a consistent speed, and then probably halfway back to the boat, I'll either slow it down a little bit or I'll speed it up. Sometimes speeding up will, if you make a long cast in clear water and you see that fish is starting to trail behind it, there's sometimes it's better to slow it down where they can catch up and eat it. Other times it's better to speed it up where it makes them react a little bit quicker, and then they're going to eat it. It's kind of, you got to play it by ear. Some days it's better to slow down, some days are better to speed it up. But overall, I'll typically always start with a consistent speed. Sometimes you'll start having to chase it or follow it, and then you'll have to adjust accordingly. Yes? Anytime fish are boiling, a swim bait's a great technique. Obviously a spook or any type walking type bait on the surface is a great topwater for breaking fish bait. It's something that makes a little bit of noise, but if the water's clear enough, I think you can't really beat the swim bait. But sometimes the water's got a little bit stain to it, and you'll need the noise to attract the fish to the bait. But I rarely, if the fish are busting bait, you can get away with a faster moving, like something that's going to walk the dog across, Czar's spook or something like that. I rarely do. Occasionally, the fish are very finicky or very hard to catch, or something like that works a little bit better. That stuff, I typically, if I know fish are chasing bait but they're not coming up to the surface, that bait can work out very well. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay. Next bait I'm going to talk about is going to be a football jig. This is something that, for me, works all year long on tour. It pretty much works anywhere you have rocks. Real simple bait to fish. If you have rocks, you can throw it. And for me, I was fishing Amistad this year for the East-West Fish Off. There's a lot of rocks and trees, things along those lines. It's my bait I fish all week long. Typically, my rule of thumb is, when I'm throwing this, is always throw it on a bait casting. I always throw, the lightest I'll go is 15-pound test. I'll go up to 20. Again, fluorocarbon line, you have no stretch, really good sensitivity. This particular jig is a 3/4 ounce, and I always like to get away with the heaviest ounce weight I can without getting stuck, a lot. So if you start fishing, say you're fishing shallow and you're throwing 3/4 ounce, but you get stuck every 2 or 3 casts, it's because you're throwing too heavy of a weight. So then I'll go down to a 1/2 ounce, see how it goes. Sometimes I'll throw 3/16. But for the most part, 1/2 ounce to 3/4 ounce is standard. I've always got them rigged up on a lake where there's rocks. It doesn't matter where the lake is in the country, this bait will catch fish if you have rocks. It's a crawdad imitation bait, so the big key for me is always to keep the bait on the bottom as much as possible. There's very few times of the year where the fish are going to eat it. If you're stroking the jig where you're hopping it and letting it fall, that's just more of a reaction strike. It's not because it's a crawdad, it's not because it's that, it's just, you're just getting them to trigger and react to the bait. That's very few times of the year they're going to eat it that way. More times than not, you're going to be fishing this bait on the bottom. So I typically like to make, if I'm fishing a point, a rock pile, or just a rocky bank, I like to make a little bit longer of a cast because it's going to be on the bottom more. There's no real reason except for the fact you're going to be in the strike zone longer. I like to make a longer cast. This particular rod's a 7'2". It's pretty stout. It's got quite a bit of backbone, a little bit soft tip. So when you make a long cast, or just in general, the fish eat the bait, you can set the hook pretty much as hard as you want, drill it into it, and begin reeling your fish in. Big things with jigs are color can make a huge difference. There's times where the crawdads are going to be a little more red, more browns, and obviously you want to match the best way you can to the crawdad. Sometimes you'll be fishing and you'll catch a fish and it'll spit up crawdad legs or a piece of crawdad, and if you can say, hey, I got a jig that looks like that, you may as well tie it on and give it a shot because you might start catching 5 times the amount of fish you were prior to that. A quick way to start getting figured out about what color is going to work best for you is just to change the trailer color. This particular bait is just a 4-inch trigger craw. Berkeley makes it. I'm just having it match the jig. It's the cinnamon, purple, and black flake. I like to have it where you typically start off with the same color. You know, try to match your jig the best you can. But a lot of times I'll throw, like I haven't got bit for a while, I'll put a black on. Or I'll throw, you know, more like a clear color. And sometimes you'll start getting a few more bites, and then you know, hey, instead of retying everything, it's a little bit easier to just change the jig trailer. And then you might then can switch the actual skirt color to match your trailer again, and you should catch a few more fish. But for me, it's a little trick. If I go to a new lake around the country and it's like, hey, I'm going to start with a brown or natural looking, you know, brown-red color, and then I haven't got bit for a while, I'll put on a green pumpkin trailer, and all of a sudden I'll catch 1 or 2, then I know, hey, I'm going to switch to green pumpkin jig with the green pumpkin trailer, and typically you'll get a few more bites that way. But as fishing this bait, I like to make a long cast. I typically retrieve it with my rod tip lower. A lot of guys, you'll see them fishing on TV, they're going to keep the rod tip over and they barely move the bait. I personally do that, but I don't get as many bites. So I like to keep my rod tip low, and I typically drag the jig more towards me. And I think the main reason is it keeps the actual jig on the bottom longer. It keeps it where it's scurrying along the bottom. A lot of times when you lift up, it lifts the jig off the bottom and it falls back down again. But for me, if I keep my rod tip real low and drag it, it's keeping the bait on the bottom the whole time. Or it's going to keep it closer to the bottom the whole time. And you'll get, for me, I get more bites that way. I mean, obviously you're imitating a crawdad, so crawdads are on the bottom. It's a little unnatural if the bait kind of comes up and goes back down and stuff. So for me, make a long cast, drag it towards you, and typically you're going to feel a rock or you're going to feel something on the bottom, you know, throughout your cast. The jig might hang up for a second, and you might have to lift up a little bit to plop it over whatever you're hung on. These baits are typically pretty weedless. They're not going to get stuck in rocks or trees and that stuff. Rarely at all. So if you ever kind of get a little bit hung up, lift your rod tip up, give it a little bit of pressure. It'll typically pop off the structure it's on, and you continue to then drop your rod tip and work it throughout. Like this, it's going to be like a worm bite or anything else where you typically feel the bite. Sometimes it'll be a pressure, a little bit mushy, but as soon as you feel the bite with the jig, I recommend setting the hook. You don't really have as much plastic. It's you got the skirted material. It's not like a plastic Senko or a worm or anything like that. They're not going to typically hang on to the bait as long. So when you do get bit, I recommend, you know, you can check a little to see if there's pressure there, if that's what you typically do, but set the hook fairly quick. A lot of times I'll just feel the boonk, and I'll know it ate it, and I don't even need to check, I just swing because I know he ate it. Sometimes, especially with spotted bass, you'll be working the bait, and you're going to feel him like eat it, and then you'll, you know, give it a second, he'll spit, because it's not, not supernatural. So it's, you know, this is something I will throw scent on occasionally. If I'm getting a lot of fish to just tap it or poke at it, a lot of times they're just going to, you know, like peck it. I'll put a little scent on it. A lot of times they'll get them to pick up the bait a little bit, hang on to it for a few seconds more. But rarely don't. Yes?
You got a plastic feathers. Do you ever find a need for the 64
I don't know. For me, I've never, I mean, I grew up in a little bit later generation. Pork was real popular, you know, early 90s, that stuff. for me, I never got into it. I know it works, and you know, there's probably in real cold conditions, it might be a little bit better, but for me, it's something I've never really got into. I thought it was more work than need be. You know, you leave it out in the sun a little bit, it hardens up on your bait. You got to make sure they keep moist. I always prefer plastic. They've made a lot of stuff that imitates the exact way the pork was. This particular bait, the chigger craw on the trailer, it actually kicks when it's, you know, you lift it off the bottom, it'll kick a little bit. They make several kind of companies now make baits that are going to have a kicking action. I think that's going to help out a little bit. If you're dragging along the bottom and it's kicking behind you, it's going to create a little more commotion and typically get you a few more bites. I typically always throw a weed guard. It's, you know, not like a real heavy weed guard. It'll pinch down easy, but if you don't throw a little bit of a weed guard, you're going to get hung up a lot more. A little weed guard will get you through a little bit of brush, over a little pieces of rock, you know, just stuff a lot easier, and you're not going to bend up your hook point a lot. A lot of times when you're rock fishing, you know, you'll get stuck and you'll pull on it for a while and it'll pop out and you reel in, your hook point's bent. That's something to always keep an eye on because you know you need to straighten it, otherwise, you know, you get the bites, you're not going to be able to land them as easy. So that's probably the biggest thing. I always keep a little bit of a weed guard, and again, always throw it on the fluorocarbon line. It's a great technique, works anywhere in the country that there's rocks, and it works year-round for me. I mean, I don't think I've had a place with rocks where you can't at least catch 1 or 2 fish in practice on it. Might not be the way to go, but because it's a jig, it's a great big fish technique, great ways to catch fish in general. I like to throw the Yamamoto double tail. That works great. I don't know, the chigger craw's kind of got a little bit different action. It really hasn't become popular as much on the West Coast. The kicking action, I think it's Net Baits makes a packet craw. There's a couple of companies out there that make a kicking type action bait. West Coast, for me, it hasn't got that popular. All my friends up in Northern California, they typically throw like a double tail Yamamoto grub. I think it works great, but a little bit of a kicking action like a Berkeley chigger craw makes kind of gives you a little bit different action that the fish haven't seen as much. I think it helps out a little bit. Yes?
You just touched on something when you went from here to the east.
Uh-huh.
I know it's a big margin.
Yeah, yes.
What part of your fishing do you have to improve drastically?
I think the big thing back east, it's a lot more mental. Fishing skill-wise, like when I went back there, I mean, there's more things I wasn't as strong in. Like when I'd go back there, I really hadn't fished rattle traps at the time, hadn't fished a few baits that I wasn't as comfortable with. But, and you learn them as you go, obviously, in fishing. But back there, I think it's more, you're not going to get as many bites. A lot of places, at least the FLW Tour goes, you're fishing for more 5-6 bites a day versus, you know, in California, typically going to a tournament, a limit's not the question of if you're going to catch it or not, it's more how big is the limit going to be. Back there, a limit's kind of a, you know, a big deal. So, you know, the fish, generally, their quality is pretty decent. I mean, you'll catch, you know, 2 to 3 to 4 pounders pretty often, but it's just catching 5 of them in a day. So for me, I think the biggest thing was mentally preparing yourself to say, hey, I might only catch 5 fish all day long, and that's kind of what my goal is. So what do I have to do to catch 5 fish, and how do I have to approach it? And, you know, do I have to junk fish? Do I have to throw a jig all day? Do I have to throw topwater all day? You know, what technique is going to get me those 5 bites that I need to get? And for me, that was the biggest thing when I went back east, is just saying, you know, you go to a new place, and you're like, oh, expecting to just catch them really good. You're like, oh, Okeechobee is supposed to be awesome. You go there and you fish for 2 days and you've had 6 bites and you're like, not so awesome. So, you know, you go there and it's like, okay, you got to really kind of figure out how to grind it out and just be able to catch fish, you know, every day and, you know, catch your limits a big year. Any other questions with the jig? Yes? Uh-huh. It's, I make a long cast, I'll keep it low, and I'll typically drag it about 2 or 3 feet, and then I'll reel up my slack. So it gives the bait time to kind of set up again. When it jigs on the bottom, the skirt typically flares out a little bit, so it's kind of almost got a little bit of action happening as you're letting it sit there. But another big deal is when I reset to kind of start reeling down, if it came off the bottom at all, it's going to fall back down to the bottom again. So, I mean, if you're fishing a real steep bluff bank, a lot of times halfway back, I'll open my bail and let more line out to make sure it's on the bottom, because that's probably the biggest key. A lot of guys will throw a jig out, they'll feel the bottom twice, the rest of the way back, they don't even feel the bottom as they're fishing the bait, and they're kind of actually out of the strike zone because the fish aren't going to typically react that way. The next thing I'm going to talk about, it's something that I don't think is quite as popular on the West Coast as it is on the East Coast. I know everyone's probably heard of it, but it's just a shaky head. On the West Coast, we throw a lot of dart heads. We drop shot a little bit more, things along those lines. But on the East Coast, everybody throws a shaky head. And I think the biggest difference on the East Coast is their fishing impoundments are a little bit shallower. Typically, you don't fish deeper than 30 feet of water. You're fishing more, 2 feet to 20 feet is average. So the fish are relating more to the bottom than they are suspended. But in the West Coast, shaky head works tremendously well. I've thrown it a lot. It works great for spotted bass. It works great for largemouth. Clear Lake Delta, Oroville, Shasta, all those lakes, I've caught a lot of fish on them. And it's a little bit different of a look than a lot of guys throw. The main difference with a shaky head versus just a standard Texas rig or a dart head is when the bait lands on the bottom, it keeps the whole bait kind of above. When you throw a dart head, it typically rolls on its side if it hits the bottom, and if you're obviously drop shotting or something, your bait's suspended. But with the shaky head, when it's on the bottom, the bait actually stands up vertical, looks like almost, whatever you're fishing, feeding on the bottom. If you're throwing, a shad imitation, it looks like little bait fish is feeding on the bottom. If you're throwing a crawdad imitation, it looks like the crawdad's kind of sticking up, what's going on. I think it can make a big difference. It's a great fish catching technique. You can catch big fish on it. Overall, it's more of a filler out limit thing. You're not going to typically catch your 10-pounder or an 8-pounder on it, anything along those lines, but you can catch a lot of 2 to 3 pounders on it. I typically always throw on an 8-pound test fluorocarbon, and if I'm fishing real shallow, I typically throw an 1/8 ounce weight. If I'm fishing more 15 to 25 foot range, I'll throw a 1/4 ounce weight. The main way I fish this bait is I'll make a long cast with it. I let the bait sink all the way to the bottom, make sure it's on the bottom, and I'll give myself a little bit of a slack line, and I just barely shake the bait. I don't need to keep complete contact with it. And if you give it a little bit of slack line, the bait still shakes or shimmers just a little bit on the bottom. And then I'll move it, 2 or 3 feet, sit there and shake it real slow again. This is a great technique if it's post-frontal where the fishing's going to be tough. You got a cold front come through. It's bluebird skies, no wind. The fishing's going to be tough. This is a great way to at least be able to catch fish still throughout the day. I always throw it on a spinning rod. I typically throw it, 8-pound, occasionally 6-pound test line. This particular rod still has pretty good backbone with a little bit of soft tip. I mean, the hook you're throwing is a decent sized hook, so you don't need to have a real flimsy rod or anything along those lines. Typically bait-wise, back east, for whatever reason, Zoom trick worms work better than anything. If you guys watch a lot of Bassmasters or FLW, like catch them on Zoom trick worm. I don't know why that huge difference is, but West Coast, they'll still work, but typically more of a natural hand-poured worm works a lot better. Robo worms, this is a Berkeley hand-poured worm. Anything that looks real natural, kind of can mimic bait fish or, crawdad color, works really well. So it's one of those techniques that, again, no matter where you're at, what you're doing, it'll work. Southern California lakes, it'll work all the way on the East Coast. It's a great technique that I think gets a little bit overlooked, especially on the West Coast because, we're more into dart heads and drop shot and things along those lines. Yes? Trick worm is a little stiffer, so it's going to stay on the hook a little bit better, and it's also going to be, stay up a little bit better. And that could be, a good reason why the trick worm works better. You can get hooks that have screw in, like you screw the worm onto the hook, and those typically work a little bit better for the robo worms. It'll keep the the bait a little bit more straight, and it's going to keep it a little bit more up in the air. A lot of plastic baits, they float in the water, so either way they're going to stay kind of vertical up there on the shaky head technique, but that's probably a good example that I took on this one. Size-wise, typically I've kind of got away from a lot of 4-inch stuff. I used to throw it a lot when I started just fishing. I'd catch a lot of fish on it, but overall I've got kind of migrated more to the 6-inch range. 5.5 to 6-inch worm typically works better for me just because you'll get a little bit bigger bites on it more often. As a tournament fisherman, obviously the bigger fish you catch, the better off you are. So, 5.5 to 6-inch, typically, you'll catch a little bit better quality on it than you would a 4-inch worm. But 4-inch worms work great for spotted bass. And these real clear lakes, they can work great, but overall, I like to throw a 6-inch.